Hi, friends. Welcome to this week's class of Dead Funny University. I am your host and fellow student, Kelsey, and this week we are taking a break from our Marvel Marathon to talk about HellBoy. He has a movie coming out this Friday on April 12th. Our visiting professor this week is my good friend Cody, who knows way too much about HellBoy, so I'm really looking forward to this class. Cody, thank you so much for being on the show today. How are you doing today?
I'm excited because it had been a while since I had really dug into Hellboy again. And going back through it, and then because I actually hadn't finished the series, I was one comic shy of finishing the series, so I actually finished everything and then put all this together, and it was a joy to do just because of how much I love Hellboy. But I'm also worried because I think I could talk forever about how great Hellboy is. So I'm nervous because I, one, want to do it justice, and two, think I will talk forever about this thing that I love so much.
We should have you and Chris have that chat about how you try to condense one of your favorite characters down into a 30-minute snippet. I don't know how Chris does it.
It's hard. It's really hard. And especially, too, because, I am obviously a fan of Hellboy, but I'm also a fan of the author. So that makes it difficult, too, because I want to talk about him a little bit.
All right. Well, usually our classes start out with you giving me an opening quiz to establish my baseline understanding of Hellboy. And I'll be honest, I did see Hellboy 2, but I did not. I remember one moment from the entire movie, and it wasn't an important plot point.
Yeah, so the title of my thing is Hellboy. You know, the red guy, what has a scary face, and the rock hand, and the big gun, and is kind of not evil, but also looks like Satan, and he has a trench coat, and he can, punch vampires, and he was Ron Perlman, and now he's the guy from the Tide ads. That's Hellboy! We're done. We already did it. So anyways, our opening quiz. Question 1. Who is the creator of Hellboy? You got Stan Lee, Mike Mignola, Macho Man Randy Savage, and Frank Miller.
I'm pretty sure I should know more of these names beyond just Stan Lee, but since I don't, I'm going to go with Mike Mignola.
That is correct. Mike Mignola is the creator of Hellboy. Yeah, so the two there, Stan Lee and Frank Miller, are both famous comic book authors, so those were a little bit confusing. And then, Macho Man Randy Savage is a wrestler that I like, so...
Also not a thing I knew.
Okay, which one of these is an example of Hellboy's roommates? The ghosts of two old Italian women that died 12 years ago. John Cena! An actual bear, or he has never slept in a house.
I think an actual bear is probably the best option.
That is incorrect, although it's given the comic book, it's actually not a bad guess. The correct answer is the ghosts of two old Italian women that died 12 years ago. That is relevant because it actually points to one of his vaguely defined superpowers, but we'll talk about that later. All right.
Okay.
Question 3. Who are Hellboy's mother and father, biological? So option 1, he has normal parents. He became Hellboy when he fell into a vat of satanic juices. Option 2, a dead witch and the devil. Option 3, the Big Show and Stacy Keibler. Real quick side note, women wrestler names are super disappointing. It was really hard to find a really fun women wrestler name to put in this to be his mom. And then the other option is a red lady gorilla and a long-horned bull.
Oh my gosh! The problem is the wrestling references you have in here. I don't know, so I might.
If you had picked it was created by Macho Man Randy Savage, that would have made me very happy, but,
I'm going to go with a dead witch and the devil.
That is correct. It is a dead witch and the devil.
Good,
hence why he looks like the devil. Crazy thing. Question 4.
Imagine that.
And I just want to say, I got this question wrong. I wrote this quiz, assumed I was correct, and then found out I wasn't when I went back and Googled it later. So, don't feel bad if you get this wrong. So question 4. What is the first Hellboy comic? The Wonder Friends Friendship is Magic, issue 1. Hellboy, Satanic WrestleMania, issue 1. Hellboy, Tamp Dancing with Devils, issue 38. Or The Next Men, issue 21.
I'm going to go with The Next Men, issue 21.
That is correct. So Hellboy was published by Dark Horse. And Mike Mignola had come up with a character, but it wasn't like a fully fleshed out comic yet. I think he was starting to write some like one-shot, short-run stuff with HellBoy, but HellBoy actually appeared in the comic book The Next Men, which was Dark Horse's kind of version of the X-Men, so it's like this weird crew of people with superpowers that fight crime, and at one point HellBoy makes like a guest star appearance in that. I got that one wrong. I was actually, and then what I wrote as the correct answer wasn't even the first HellBoy comic. The first HellBoy comic was, I thought it was the Seeds of Destruction issue 1. It's not. It's the Wolves of St. Augustine. I was totally wrong. I know nothing about HellBoy. All right. What team is HellBoy sometimes affiliated with? This one might be easy for you because you've seen the trailer. But so the first option is the BPRD, the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense. Second option is the BPRD, the Bureau for Punching Random Dead Things. The third option is the BWKASS, the Bureau for Witch Killing and Satan Slapping. Fourth option is the Justice League, and the fifth option is WWE.
This is the only one where I genuinely would have believed there was a wrestling reference. Like, up until now, I would have had no idea if you hadn't told me.
I love the idea of, I love all of these ideas, but I'm going to go with, my favorite, to be clear, is Punching Random Dead Things, but I am going to go with Paranormal Research and Defense.
That is correct. Man, my favorite one was the Bureau for Witch Killing and Satan Slapping, although, as a funny side note, you could have gotten a few points for saying the WWE, because at one point HellBoy was a masked wrestler, but that, you know, technically not WWE, but it is pretty close, so, you know. Anyways. Alright, so to start out with, I want to talk to you about Mike Mignola. So Mike Mignola is the creator of HellBoy. And when he started his career, he graduated from art school at Berkeley and knew that he wanted to, like, what he wanted to do growing up was draw monsters. But that's not really a career, so he decided to get into the comic book industry. And he started out by moving to New York and being an inker for Marvel. So the first thing I want to ask you, just to see if you know the difference, is do you know what the difference between an inker and like a drawer is in terms of comic books?
So I don't, but I would guess that the drawer is the one that's actually like drawing out the base concept, and the inker is going back in and filling it in with the right colors.
Yeah, that's totally correct. So, and
okay.
In the industry, and I think especially at this time, there's kind of a stigma against inkers. Like, it's kind of seen, I think, as the lesser job. Now, that's not so much true anymore with, like, digital art and so many comic books being, like, sole published online, but, like, your massive companies, like your Marvels and your DCs, especially at this time, like, they didn't have a way to do digital art. So it was all hand-drawn and then scanned. So they needed, like, warm bodies to just ink the 7,000 issues of the Avengers that were coming out. They had so many comics. They're like, we need a kid with a pulse that will work for no money to color in these pictures as quickly as he can. And by Mike Mignola's own admission, he was terrible at it. He was the worst inker ever. He did not like doing it, but it paid the bills. And the thing was, since he was local to Marvel, because he like lived right next to Marvel, it was really easy for him to get work. Eventually, however, he moved across the country back to California, and then all that work dried up because they had to physically mail pages to him to get him to ink them and then send them back. And he wasn't very good at it. So they're like, no. You're done. So that was when he first got into drawing comic books. So this is kind of an interesting tie over with you guys talking about all the Marvel movies and all that stuff. He actually did draw one of the Avengers, which was Rocket Raccoon. So way back in the 80s.
Cool.
Yeah, if you look, a few comic books of Rocket Raccoon were drawn by Mike Mignola. Now, at this point, he still wasn't really writing his own stories. He would, like, get a script and then have to draw the comic book and then send it away to be inked. So he came up in the 80s, and throughout the 80s, like, he started out at Marvel and then just bounced back and forth. As work would come up, he would just do whatever came his way. But really his, like, breakout thing that got him into, like, his own style was Batman. In a lot of ways, Batman is kind of a, like, proto-Hellboy. A lot of the inspiration for Hellboy did come from his work with Batman. And specifically, like, the one that kind of made him realize what his style was, I think, was the comic book series Gotham by Gaslight, which is actually now being made into a video game. So, Gotham by Gaslight was a reimagining of Batman where it was set in Victorian times. And for Mike Mignola, this was like a revelation because, as he said himself in an interview many times, he hates drawing cars. He just wants an excuse to not draw cars, or really anything normal. So a comic book set in the Victorian age, when there were maybe some horses and horse-drawn carts, but there weren't any cars, was great for him. But
anything to not draw cars.
Anything to not draw cars. And actually, a different Batman comic, the name of it escaped me, I'm sorry, that he solely wrote the story for later was kind of, again, one of like the early inspirations for Hellboy, was a Batman comic where Batman fell into a grave and then woke up in like a Cthulhu-esque nightmare. That was, again, one of those comics that was like, oh, this is actually what I want to do. And
because he wants to draw monsters.
Because he just wants to draw monsters and he doesn't want to draw cars, and he's really bad at drawing those things. And when we get to some examples of his art style, that becomes really clear. Like, his art style is very weird, it's very minimalist, and it would not lend itself to big cars. So, like, drawing the Batmobile is a nightmare for him. But then, this isn't on the quiz because it's really esoteric, but this is a funny question. He actually did some, during this time when he's bouncing around between jobs, he actually did some concept art for a Disney movie, which means he actually did, the same guy that made Hellboy, came up with one Disney princess. Do you want to guess who it was? I love this little fact.
Based on the fact that he really wants to draw, like, obscure things, I'm going to go with, like, Alice in Wonderland.
Good guess, but no. It was Atlantis. He actually made the concept art for Disney's Atlantis. And a lot of the characters, you can kind of see the inspiration for. Like, they changed them a lot. Mostly they gave them much larger eyes. But he actually, a lot of his original concept art does come through in that movie. And especially in, like, the way the technology looks. And the kind of, like, minimalist steampunk stuff is very Mike Mignola. And also just a lot of the structures of the way Atlantis looks a lot like the stuff that Mike Mignola did. But actually, the princess then that he did was Kida, who is the princess from... Kida. Sorry, I don't actually like that movie very much. Mandy hates me for it. I know.
I am so with Mandy.
I know.
Cody, you're just wrong.
In an interview, the interviewer kind of gave him some grief about... They kind of asked him, like, so was it you that made Kida so feminine? And he's like, no, that was Disney. So this is his original concept art, and this is a screenshot of Kida. So you can kind of see, like, Mike Mignola's style on the, what would that be, the right? The black and white picture. I don't know my right from my left when I'm looking at a reflection of this. And then what the character became. But you can see some of the details are there. You know, like the gauntlets and the kind of like, I don't want to say loincloth, but like robe thing, you know. So it's close.
Yeah.
But it's interesting.
It's got the same kind of vibe, but
yeah.
his was definitely, it was less feminine hype kind of thing.
Yeah,
I don't have a better way of saying it than that.
Yeah, neither did the interviewer, but it was a little bit funny to see him kind of squirm through that answer. But anyways, we're not here to talk about Disney princesses. We're here to talk about Hellboy. So let's talk about Hellboy. So the first sketch of Hellboy, which the picture on the left there is not it, was done at a convention as a joke. So originally when he would go to conventions like your Comic-Cons and stuff, people would ask him to draw things, and he would just draw Batman, because that's what he was known for at the time. He was the Gotham by Gaslight guy. So then he was like, I just don't want to do that anymore. So he just kind of, on a whim, drew this, like, really satanic-looking monster. It had evil-looking bat wings. It had all these paranormal devices hanging from a belt. And he gave it this really big belt buckle. And he's like, well, that belt buckle needs something written on it. And he's like, I don't know, let's just call him Hellboy for fun, you know, as like, to be funny. And then he kind of fell in love with the character a little bit. And what ended up happening is that Mike Mignola realized he doesn't really want to write comics. What he wants to do is write folk stories. So he loves folk stories, he loves ghost stories, he loves mythology, and that's what he really wants to draw. But the problem is, you can't just do, like, random Irish folktale that no one's ever heard of by Mike Mignola and sell a book. So he's like, I kind of need an IP that I can use as a vehicle for this stuff. And that's when he was like, hey, Hellboy, he's a paranormal detective, and he goes on adventures. And that was kind of the idea that made him want to stick with Hellboy. Is Hellboy was this character that he didn't think he would get bored drawing, and that he could kind of use as a way to tell the stories he really wanted to tell. So then on the left is Hellboy in the first trade-in paperback in the series. So like, this is a weird question. Do you know what like the difference between like a trade-in is versus like an individual comic book?
No idea. What is
Oh,
this?
okay. So this is like valuable just comic book information in general. So like, let's say you wanted to start reading any comic book series, right? The individual, like what you would think of as a comic books are hard to find and are very rarely printed after the date of their release. So buying comic books is kind of like watching a TV show when you didn't have VCRs, right? You just had to go to the comic book store on Wednesday and buy that comic you wanted, because the next week they have another one and you can't get that old one anymore, unless they just have stock laying around. So, if you're someone like me and is late to the party, there are these things called trade-in paperbacks, which is where you take a big stack of those old tiny comic books, staple them together, and you get a big graphic novel, basically. So okay. Trade-in paperbacks are basically graphic novels. So the first graphic novel, which I thought the first issue of the first graphic novel was the first issue of Hellboy. It's not. It's called Seeds of Destruction. That's what we see here. And that is kind of my first picture that I got of the comic book Hellboy. So right away, you can kind of see what I mean about the minimalist art style. There's not a lot of detail, and the use of color is very, like, flat. But, you know, he's got the big stone fist. He, at some point, does have a big gun. He has a belt full of trinkets, and he fights monsters. So Hellboy's character, like him as a person, and what Mike Mignola kind of liked about him, was that he's just very clearly Satan. Like, to look at him, like, that's the devil. He, like, you can't see his feet. He has goat feet and a tail. And he has horns. He's Satan. You know, he's got red eyes. What do you want? He's the devil. But he himself is a really good guy that's super nice to everybody. And in the comic book, everyone just treats him like a guy for the most part. So this is kind of, you know, spoilers for the movie, but a lot of times in the movies, especially the Ron Perlman movies, he's like, oh, you're a secret monster and no one can know about you. It's like, nah, in the comic books, he just like walks into a bar and the bartender's like, oh, hey, Hellboy, how's it going? Good to see you again. And everyone just knows him and he's like, hi, I'm everyone's friendly neighborhood Hellboy. So this guy, Hellboy, your friendly neighborhood paranormal investigator, became the vessel that he used to tell all these stories. A lot of the comic books are very Victorian in theme, like a lot of the art style ends up looking like that because it's just the time frame that Mike Mignola liked drawing. But technically the comic book is set in modern day. It's just like Hellboy never really walks into a city. He's always like somewhere in a forest and then fairies attack him, you know. And we'll get into that in the next slide. But real quick, I want to touch on his superpowers because they're my favorite superpowers, which is, I don't know, they're not very well defined. He has a red fist that is made of stone that is hard to break and he can use to hit things. So that's like a kind of a superpower. He never really dies until the comic book decides he should, and then he kind of does. But life and death are very things in this series, so it doesn't matter that much. But he is, like, basically unkillable because he's kind of a demon, but he gets hurt. So it's like if you stab him, he falls down. And then later he just kind of wakes back up and he's like, ugh, I got stabbed. Dang it. Better remove the spear through my heart for the 50th time. So he's kind of indestructible, but he also does get hurt pretty easily too, so yeah. And he's like pretty strong, but he's not like super strong, I wouldn't say. He's just strong for a guy, but at the same time, if something bigger than him hits him, he just gets like flung around. And then the only other two superpowers I would say that he have is one, just like a scholarly background. He's like his tagline is the world's greatest paranormal detective, so he has years of knowing about the paranormal and knows a lot about mythology and history and how to fight these things. And then the other thing is sometimes he can talk to ghosts. Not all the time, but sometimes. When they decide to have him talk to ghosts. So that question earlier in the quiz, when I asked who his roommates were, there was like 3 years in the comic book where he lived in a house that used to be lived in by these 2 old Italian women, and then he just lived with their ghosts. Which, like, there's scenes in the comic book where he's, like, having conversations with them and sitting at dinner, and then it cuts and Hellboy's sitting alone in a dilapidated house, just drinking wine. And it's like, this is a strange story. Alright. So, let's talk about the origins of Hellboy. Hellboy was originally summoned by Rasputin, which, like, from history, Grigory Rasputin.
Yeah, I was gonna guess. Okay, that's kind of a cool tie-in.
Yeah, he, at the time, was working with the Nazis, trying to bring about the end of the world, as Rasputins do. And, while trying to summon the end of the world, accidentally summons Hellboy. Hellboy was then found by Trevor Broom, who himself was, like, a paranormal expert. Trevor Broom named him accidentally, so in this little scene of the comic that you're seeing right here, where they summon him, they say, like, oh, it's a demon sent to destroy us all, kill it. And then that lady's like, nah, I think it's just a little boy. And then Professor Broom says, a Hellboy. And that's where he got his name. It just stuck. So Professor Broom kind of accidentally called him Hellboy, and then everyone just started calling him Hellboy. And then you can see that little photograph of him sitting with World War II soldiers. So he's originally, like, he was born in World War II, basically. Growing up, he lived with Trevor Broom. He grew up on Lobster Johnson and Folktales. Lobster Johnson actually eventually becomes a recurring character, and he's like a 50s detective that would, you know, go and solve crimes and had, like, the internal monologue witty banter. So Hellboy as a little kid would watch like these serial shows about Lobster Johnson, and his adopted father Trevor Broom would tell him folk tales and all that because that's what he was an expert in. He also loved pancakes, you know, because he was a little kid. Little kids love pancakes.
I mean, yeah.
Eventually,
I actually hate pancakes.
What?
Move on. I hate pancakes. I don't like them.
Which
really sucks because everywhere I go, people are always like, oh, here, let's give you some thank you for coming to our house. Here's pancakes. And I'm like, awesome. Yay. Thank you.
We'll talk about this later. Also, I think I've made you pancakes. Anyways, as he grows up and matures, he becomes the world's greatest paranormal detective for the BPRD. That's also like what Trevor Broom was working for when he found him. Technically, he is the son of the devil and the witch, which is revealed later in the comic book. So the stories of Hellboy, there's not really a strict chronology to them. There kind of is if you work really hard, but for the most part, they're episodic stories where he fights through folklore. So, like, there are some examples of things that he fights against. So, like, Kashi the Deathless is like an Eastern European folktale about a guy that like has Baba Yaga make him not able to die. He fights Baba Yaga. He fights with luchador vampire hunters. He fights the Hydra, mermaids.
Are luchador vampire hunters a thing?
Yeah, they're actually in the movie. There's a little clip of them.
Oh my god.
Yeah.
I'm so excited by this.
It's actually kind of a sad story. Like, he's hunting vampires in Mexico and then busts in, like, on the vampires while they're fighting luchadors. And then just, like, joins the luchadors as they fight the vampires. But then one of the luchadors gets bit and turned into a vampire. And then he has to kill that guy that's, like, his friend. And it's kind of a sad story where he likes to, like, go and... They, like, do it in a wrestling match, though. Like, that's where I was saying he at one point was a wrestler. After that, he just, like, became a luchador for a while. But, yeah. Anyways, weird stories of Hellboy, right? And then also the Fae. And I would say kind of a special mention to the Fae. A lot of the story revolves around, like, the fairy courts. And particularly, like, Irish and English folklore is a lot of what he ends up fighting his way through. That scene over there on the left... Is it the left side of the screen for you?
For me, I'm looking at it on the left.
Okay, on the left side of the screen, that the little blue guy that is flying next to the giant pig is a changeling that he found and then had to go and find the little girl that he had replaced. And then that pig guy, like, kills the changeling, and then he has to fight that giant pig guy. It's just all like random stuff from mythology, and Mike Mignola wants to draw monsters, so he gets to draw a giant pig guy. Also, something else that we think we saw in the movie trailers, but we'll see about that. All right, and then these are just two other little clips from the comic that I like. The one on the left is where he's fighting the Baba Yaga, which she becomes a recurring character throughout the story as like this powerful figure from folklore that he kind of fights all the time. And then the frame on the right is the comic where it's revealed who his mother and father are. You see Satan grabbing this witch and dragging her down to hell in like a vision. And that little thing where Satan turns to Hellboy and calls him his favorite son. But looking at these comics... To me, these are also just great examples of the artwork of Mike Mignola. This is, to me, like him at his best. It's very minimalist and very flat. There is not a lot of detail in any of the frames. Things are very solid, and the shading is not very complicated. So when you compare this to a lot of comics that you usually see that are very bright and very colorful, these are comic books where most things are in shadow, and then when they're not, there are only maybe 3 colors in each little frame of the comic. And I loved...
Out of curiosity... Sorry, I'm interrupting, but
no,
go
ahead.
That's because he's been an inker, and he's like, I know what it's like to have to fill these in. Like, I want to make this very easy for you guys.
No, I think it was a style that he eventually found.
Okay.
For him, I think it is that he doesn't have a lot of interest in drawing things that he doesn't want to draw. And what's in this scene that matters is Hellboy and the Baba Yaga. Who cares what's in the background? Same thing with like there where you see the devil. There's just like vague impressions of the background. And as I flip through more and more of these comics, they very quickly become like almost impressionist paintings because of how tiny of detail he can put in to get an idea across. But then that means those details that are there stand out so much. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah.
Especially like the scene where you just see the devil and you just see the red eyes and the horse with the one red eye. Or you see Hellboy in the shadows and you just kind of get that silhouette. It's very noir inspired. So everything is always kind of in shadow and always dark. And lit in interesting ways, I kind of think. Or just not lit well. But to me, when I was reading this comic, it was just like a breath of fresh air of this kind of new style that I really hadn't seen a lot before. But I got really obsessed with. All right, so now I'm going to try to talk about the plot of Hellboy, and I am going to be bad at it, because it is confusing. So, at the beginning of the story, he is summoned by Rasputin, and taken by humans immediately, and kind of raised to be good. After that, he works for the BPRD, just stopping all manner of fairy tale creatures. But throughout the comic book, over and over and over again, he is told that he is like the beast of the apocalypse. He is going to end the world. It doesn't matter what he does. He has to eventually live up to his birthright, which is being the son of Satan, and cause the apocalypse. And that scene is kind of on the left in this comic book page, where at this time it's like the queen of the vampires is telling him that, he has to be the son of the devil. And that, he only has 2 choices, is to either, like, embrace who he is or die. And that's where he says, like, screw you, and just rips his horns off. And then chooses to be Hellboy. And that, to me, is one of the strongest themes throughout the comic. Is Hellboy is a character that is told that he is destined to be anything but just Hellboy. And no matter how many times that comes up, he always just stays Hellboy. Kind of an identity that he has made up for himself. That is how he sees himself, and he's very confident in that. And this kind of touches on something that the movies often do, which, like, you saw the trailer, right? That thing where he's like, you made me into a weapon! Not how Hellboy is in the comics. He's very comfortable being Hellboy, and wants to be fighting evil monsters and saving people. He doesn't consider himself to be a weapon, and he really never lets the prophecies about him, whether they're good or bad, define who he is as a person. And I really loved that about the comics.
Wow.
That was like one of the first things that I loved about it, is this, like, oh, you're prophesied to be this, and he's just like, nope, horns are coming off. I'm Hellboy. Doesn't matter. So, eventually, and like I would say halfway through the comic book series, he quits the BPRD. And this, again, is one of the things about Hellboy that I love, is the reason that he quits. So in the movies, a lot of times, like in the Ron Perlman movies, he quit because he's like, the BPRD just treats me like a monster and I want to be a person. In the comics, he quits because of the way the BPRD treats other members of the BPRD. They eventually find this homunculus, which is like I think it's a Jewish folklore homunculus, which is like a being made of mud that they make alive by magic. They find this...
A golem.
Yeah. They find this homunculus and just immediately start treating him like a disposable human. They're like, well, he's hard to kill, so we're just going to send him on suicide missions with HellBoy. And then eventually, because they're worried about him going rogue, they implant a bomb in his chest and then give HellBoy the detonator. They're like, hey, we're sending this this homunculus Roger with you. Here's the detonator for his heart. And he's like, come again now? And then at the end of the comic book, gives Roger his own detonator and quits the BPRD because of that. But at no point was he really the subject of their ridicule. He's always well liked, but he just didn't like the way they were treating other people. So
wow,
yeah, and that becomes important later on in like a kind of epilogue for the whole story. But yeah, so after he quits the BPRD, he just kind of drifts on his own. It's during this time that he kind of dies and has like a vision quest in Africa, and then wanders around in Africa for a while. And then he gets pulled down to the bottom of the ocean and fights mermaids for a bit, because why not? There's just not a lot of rules, and it's just whatever Mike Mignola feels like drawing, HellBoy wanders through. But again...
Oh my gosh. He's just a lackey for carrying Mike Mignola, whatever. I don't know how to say his name, and I'm sorry.
I know, I do too, and I've heard it pronounced right.
He's just a vessel for carrying around this guy's creativity. Like,
yeah.
I feel like drawing something underwater, so he's going to go fight mermaids.
Yep.
This is amazing.
And I mean, if you're a fan of folklore, I named like the big ones. There is a ton of real folklore in these stories. That's just like, HellBoy's walking through a forest, and then there's like a Japanese folklore about these floating heads that kill people. He fights those, It's just like, he finds those and fights them. Because he's the world's greatest paranormal detective, so that's what he does. But again, no matter... It comes up again and again throughout this time that he's prophesied to bring about the end of the world, but no matter what, he never stops being HellBoy, even when it means he has to quit the BPRD, even when it means he has to leave and do his own thing. He always stays this version of moral that he has decided is moral. All right. So these last two trade-ins, the Wild Hunt and the Storm and the Fury, kind of get their own section because they are, one, what the new movie is going to be about, and two, probably the most like, this is like the narratively cohesive part that ends the story of HellBoy. So they kind of are their own story. So the story starts with the Wild Hunt, which you saw the trailer, right? Did you see the guys with like green cloaks on riding the horses?
Yeah.
That's the Wild Hunt. They are British aristocrats that when giants get crazy in Britain, they form a wild hunt and they go and kill the giants. They invite HellBoy to go with them because Trevor Broom, HellBoy's adopted father, had done it. And they're like, hey, HellBoy, come help us out, right? So, while on the wild hunt, they betray HellBoy, stab him in the back, and leave him for dead in the river. HellBoy comes to, and the whole wild hunt has been killed by giants. So they failed their goal of killing the giants and died themselves. He picks up a broken shard of a sword and goes like into a crazy blood rage and kills all the giants. So then we're going to cut to what's happening in the world of Fairy. So partially because of HellBoy doing very good at his job, a lot of like the supernatural creatures in England are feeling downtrodden and like they can't get ahead because HellBoy's stopping them. This causes one of them, that changeling from earlier, he becomes the pig that ate him. It's a weird thing. Anyways, this creature that HellBoy defeated eventually digs up the body of this thing that they call the Blood Witch. Or the Blood Queen. The Blood Witch Queen. Anyways.
Yeah.
Her name's Nimue. She's the person that gave Arthur his sword, and she's an evil witch. They summon her, and this is very much like the nuclear option. Like, she was ripped to pieces by other witches and put in a box, and then buried really far underground, because she's super dangerous and kills everything. So that's who they summon to be like, hey, Hellboy's not willing to end the world, so now it's on you. And she instantly starts killing everything. So this is like, what's her name? Is it Mila Jovovich? Is that who it is?
Are you talking about Hela in the most recent Ragnarok movie?
No, I'm not talking about... I'm talking about the witch that you saw in the Hellboy trailer. This is Nimue. She was resurrected in this comic.
Okay.
After Hellboy goes on the wild hunt, he visits Alice Monaghan, who is the little girl that he saved from a changeling way earlier in the story. She is now an adult. He doesn't age, so they're now the same age. They go on an adventure together and find out that Hellboy's mother was actually descended from King Arthur. So she is in a long line of witches that was descended from King Arthur, which makes Hellboy technically the rightful king of England and able to wield Excalibur. So the end of the wild hunt is Hellboy basically getting the sword Excalibur and finding out he can summon an army of dead British soldiers to fight off Nimue, the evil witch, right? So then we get to the comic, The Storm and the Fury. And that comic book starts with Hellboy being like, you know who I got this sword Excalibur? Nah, that ain't me. And just like gives it back to Alice and says, do whatever you want with it. I'm going to go fight Nimue on my own terms. At this point, Ragnarok, like the end of the world, starts in earnest. Nimue has like an army of evil monsters that she's using to try to destroy England. England itself doesn't really ever get invaded. Like, these monsters are kind of in like a supernatural plane that is nowhere. It's hard to describe. Alice just gives the sword to someone else who goes and fights them endlessly, and it just kind of ultimately results in nothing happening. But anyways, so Nimue the Witch is now kind of without an army. Hellboy does not have Excalibur and is going to fight her. So that scene that you see on the left is Hellboy walking cloaked and hidden up to Nimue's castle to fight her. He is missing an eye at this point that he traded to Baba Yaga so he could pass to Nimue's castle without being stopped. I don't really know how that works, but it's what happened in the comic because it's very folklore-esque.
Okay.
And basically, Hellboy arrives just in time for Nimue to become a vessel for the Ogdru Jihad, which is like in the lore of the comic, I think it's supposed to be like the seven-headed dragon of the apocalypse, you know?
Okay.
So she turns into a giant dragon, and Hellboy shows up in time for her to be an unkillable dragon, and then is just like, well, I can't do anything to stop you, but I'm gonna try, and just starts punching the dragon in the head. But it's a dragon and he's Hellboy, so that doesn't work. At which point, Hellboy is defeated, he's laying on the ground, like, dying and bleeding. And that's when Vasilisa, from the story of Kashi the Deathless, who got turned into a raven, appears to him, turns into a dagger, and then Hellboy uses that to kill the dragon. And that makes about as much sense as it sounded like it made when I said it, which is very little sense at all. Vasilisa is a little girl that at some point in the comic book Hellboy tried to save. He failed, she got killed, she turned into a ghost, then she turned into a raven that got turned into the crown of Nimue that broke while Hellboy was fighting her, and then she turned into a dagger that Hellboy used to stab the dragon.
So what you're telling me is Mike here went, oh no, I've drawn myself into a corner where I have to kill my character. Crap, I'm gonna not do this by using the most obscure, bizarre, nonsensical thing to get him out of this.
Well, no, because Hellboy dies in this comic, so he doesn't really save Hellboy.
Oh.
What it is that it's very much inspired by folklore, and if you've read a lot of folklore mythology, it makes no sense. Things are constantly transforming and shifting between what they are. So really what this is to me is Vasilisa is the spirit of someone that he helped and then came back to help him fight a dragon.
Uh-huh.
It's a very folklore-y answer, but that's what happens in the...
all the time in folklore, yeah.
Right. So, like I said, this is what we're going to see in the movie. You see the Queen Nimue, you see the Wild Hunt, you even see Hellboy wielding a sword, which I'm guessing is Excalibur, but might also be his, like, the sword of the devil, because at some point in the trailer he has, like, the fiery crown and the tusks, or, like, the horns, which doesn't happen in this.
And the sword is on fire.
And the sword is on fire. It looks super satanic, so I don't actually know if they're going to, like, talk about this thing where he's both prophesied to be the end of the world and also prophesied to be the true king of England, and he rejects both of them and just goes and punches a dragon. Anyways.
I can easily see why this character relates to you.
Yeah, it's my favorite comic book for so many reasons, and a lot of it is the way Hellboy, one, just seems to not have a lot of strict rules, and then two, it's just that I love the character that rejects his destiny and will not accept that he is anything but what he has decided to be. Anyways, so now we're going to talk about a separate comic book, one that's relevant, and then we're going to briefly touch on Hellboy and Hell. So I doubt this is going to happen in the movie, but in the comic book, after Hellboy slays Nimue, the witch dragon, as she's dying, she rips his heart out and drags him to hell. Break in the story. That really ends like the Rasputin summoned Hellboy to end the world, and then he doesn't story. That is kind of the full arc of that story. Hellboy in hell is what happens to him when he goes to hell after the witch drags him to hell. But first we're going to talk about The Magician and the Serpent, which is technically not a Hellboy comic, but it matters later. So, The Magician and the Serpent is technically a story written by Mike Mignola's daughter, Katie, when she was 7. Mike Mignola read the story and loved it and decided to do artwork for it, so he drew the comic book. Katie Mignola, his daughter, wrote it. He considers it to be his best work. It's his favorite thing that he's ever done. And it's a very simple story about a magician that makes these 3 floating objects, which you can see in like the top right of the comic, disappear. And then gets very sad, and the snake asks him, "Why are you sad?" And he says, "Well, I made those things disappear, but when they return, the spell's over and I'm going to die." And the snake's like, "No, I don't want you to die," because they were friends. They spend the next few years just living with each other and having fun. It's the best years of their life. And then eventually the shapes return and the magician has to die. And the last line of the comic book is, "The magician died, but he was happy in his passing because he was so well loved by the snake." So just keep that in the back of your mind as something that's relevant.
Okay.
So Hellboy in Hell, as Mike Mignola described it, is kind of his dream world. Hellboy goes to hell, and that means he doesn't ever have to draw cards again. He can draw whatever he wants. It's weird and Victorian. It's full of strange monsters and dragons. And it's just Hellboy having similar adventures where he's just kind of solving mysteries in hell. Throughout his time in hell, he meets his family, he meets his father, he meets his brothers, and eventually he meets his sister. He kills his father basically right away, for understandable reasons. And then his brothers and his uncles kind of kill themselves trying to kill him, because they're all now vying for the throne of hell. But ultimately, they all fail to kill Hellboy. Then later, his sister kind of accuses him of killing his brothers, and sicks the Furies on him, which are like the Furies from mythology.
Yeah.
They find out she was lying and then kill her, which ends the bloodline of hell and causes hell to start collapsing. So at this point, again, we have this theme of Hellboy has to take up the throne of hell, otherwise hell is going to collapse. And in the last few frames of the comic, the last issue of the comic really, is told from third-person perspective. It's some other demon telling the story of Hellboy when he took up his father's sword and crown at the very end. Mm-hmm. And basically he describes Hellboy as turning into this mountainously tall creature that rips apart hell and kills everything in it. Oop! I slapped my microphone. Apologies. Before breaking off his horns and walking away by himself. So again, it is Hellboy rejecting the notion of him having any kind of destiny.
Wow.
And
he's just not having it. That's amazing.
No, he's not. And it's why he's my favorite comic book character. And these are the last 2 frames of the comic book after Hellboy has just walked away from hell into nothingness. And it's just, I'm going to read the few little lines here. "Shoot it, kill it. It's a demon from hell come to destroy us. No, just a little boy. A Hellboy." And you see those 3 floating objects.
Uh-huh.
And so this is kind of the part where I'm going to geek about Hellboy a little bit and talk about why I find Hellboy to be a beautiful story. So Hellboy was a very action-packed comic book where he punched a lot of things and did a lot of like dare and do and fought a lot of monsters. But to me, in the end of the story, his life has meaning because of the people that he helped and the people that love him. So to me, the idea of having those three floating objects that we saw at the end of The Magician and the Snake is supposed to kind of harken back to the message of that comic book, where the magician was happy in passing because he was so well loved by the snake that was his friend.
Yeah.
To me, this is a story about Hellboy having all of these prophecies about him and doing all of these great things. And at the end of the day, what mattered is that when he left, he had treated people like Roger correctly. That he had saved people like Alice Monaghan, and that he had been a good person and helped people. It didn't matter that he fought a dragon. It didn't matter that he ripped hell apart. What mattered was that people remembered all of the things that he had done for them and that he had lived that type of life. I also appreciated the comic book, and I've kind of said this before, he rejected the idea of being a chosen one. At the end of the story, he's nothing special. He's just a little boy, a Hellboy. And I like that he never, like, oh, I've become this big important thing, or I've become something greater than I am. Through the whole story, he just remains Hellboy. He doesn't pick up Excalibur and become the King of England. He doesn't want it. He's decided that who he is Hellboy, the world's greatest paranormal detective. And he's going to live his entire life just like that. And I loved that in the story. That, you know, a lot of times you see that from like villains, that it's like, oh, you know, you're going, you know, you have to make this hard choice, or you have to do these things. And he's always looking for like the third option. He's like, no, you know, I know that that's what I'm supposed to do, but who's to decide what Hellboy's supposed to do? He's Hellboy. He does whatever he wants.
Yeah.
But it's not just that he's like flippant and immoral. It's that he actually cares about these things. And then to me, it's a story that ends perfectly, which is rare. It's, to me, rare for an author. This story went on for 20 years. Like, this was 20 years of comics.
Whoa, man.
That were solely written by Mike Mignola, and eventually he ended them. And to me, ended them in a way that was poetic and beautiful and had relevance to him. It wasn't a big climactic ending. There wasn't like a big end fight where he punches the devil. That's not, to me, the point of the story. And to me, it's an admirable thing when a guy is making money off of this comic book and goes like, but in my head, this story ends. Like, when I wrote the story, it hit a point where it ended. And for Hellboy, the ending was finding this last meaning in his life. I also, and I mean, we've talked about this a little bit, the art style to me is incredible. It, you know, like, it's like an old engineering saying that it's like doing with $1 what any fool can do with $2. To me, if Mike Mignola can get across the same feeling and the same emotion and the same weight with fewer lines and fewer colors, that just makes him a better artist. And I think it makes his style very unique and very personal, and gives just a perfect tone to the comic books of being this kind of noir, but also very fairy tale-esque and very folk tale-y story. The art to me is not unapproachable. It's very easy to read and get into, and also is not like overly extravagant. He never makes these large, garish pictures. They're always very reserved and very subtle, which is kind of the way Hellboy's character is. You know, he's never like this crazy, like, flying through the air, punching air. You know, he's a more reserved character. Like, most of the time, he looks like he does in the top left frame. He's just kind of, like, slouching and holding still until he gets punched and then flies through the air. And then the last thing that I like about this series is just the reverence to the source material. A lot of it, like I said, is inspired by mythology, but it really is inspired by mythology. It's not just like we have a guy... I don't want to, like, dunk on Thor because that's mean, but you know what I mean. That it's like, Thor is not the Thor from mythology in the Marvel movies, right? He's, like, loosely inspired, but they round over a lot of the rough edges, you know what I mean? Same thing with, like, Odin, or, like, Hercules in the Disney movies, right? They, like, I mean, it's kind of Hercules-ish. All of these things are very much like, he wants to be writing folk tales, and folk tales are weird, and they don't make a lot of sense, and that's how he writes his stories. he doesn't find the need to have this like really strict narrative that a lot of things feel that they need to have, or strict rules. It's like, it's comic books. What are the rules? He likes folktales, you know?
He likes folktales, and he's going to draw monsters, and
Yeah.
he's going to do whatever it takes to do those things.
Right. And then kind of the other thing, I was thinking about this today, and this is a difference between the movies and the comic book Hellboy, is that a lot of times in movies, right, your main hero, especially now, is like this kind of sarcastic, quippy guy that's like, I make jokes all the time. And I think that's what they're going to end up doing with Hellboy, is that he's going to be this quippy character that's kind of sarcastic and picks on people. And you can see that in the trailers where he's like kind of messing with all of like the people working with him and like trolling at them. And Hellboy does that, but only to like the monsters and the demons and like these demigods that would tell him what to do. Like, that's when he's quippy and sarcastic, is when someone's making these big prophecies. But when he's dealing with normal people, he's very earnest and very sincere in his dealings. He legitimately cares about the people around him and wants them to be doing well, and that's how he acts. So he's kind of a refreshing character in that way, that he is sarcastic and quippy, but only at people that deserve it. And everyone else, he like earnestly cares about them. Which is just kind of a branch from a lot of times what you see in like normal superheroes, is that they've just become like sarcastic quip machines, which is very much not what Hellboy is.
Well, not only sarcastic quip machines, but and this may be an unfair thing to say from where I'm standing, but we kind of have a very limited view of the types of masculinity that can be shown in these superhero movies. Usually, like, we got the brooder who sits and is very serious about everything, and then we've got like the angry guy, and we're just now getting into like the sarcastic guy who's really powerful, which is why I think it's taking off, is because it's like, wow, this person isn't brooding, isn't he fun? And the idea of somebody that's earnest and sincere and genuine and like is a person of feeling, but is still powerful enough to like kick some major ass is a little bit rare, and a little bit like we don't really know how to fit that in neatly in our heads to some of these other roles. So it may be that they weren't quite sure how to make him into that, but it sounds amazing and like a valuable character to have on the screen.
Yeah, this is where like I get a little bit sad, because I doubt they're gonna do that in the movie. The movie's probably gonna be Hellboy just, you know, drops F-bombs and says sassy lines to everybody, which he does, but not really to like people. He does that to like demons that are like, you have prophesied to become. Then he's just like, shut up, and punches them in the face. But to normal people, he's just like, hi, I'm Hellboy. You need help fixing the goats or whatever?
Fixing the goats.
There's weird stuff with goats and cows in the comic, but
yeah, that I believe.
All right, so I think. Oh wait, no, I forgot the final quiz.
Well, I actually have questions.
Oh, okay. Questions before the final quiz. Sorry.
Anywhere near that. So
Boom.
get that final quiz out of my face.
All right, we're going back one, because I love looking at this last frame.
So just to double check, his only name is Hellboy. That was given to him by Trevor Broom, and is his identity. He doesn't have any other name. Is that correct?
I think he does. I think it's like Ogdrundrama or something like that. I cannot spell it. It is referenced very infrequently. Like, it comes up, I think, once that someone calls him by his birth name. It's not often.
Okay, it's some kind of demonic thing.
Yeah, I think he does technically have a saintly name, but it is infrequently used to the point of almost being meaningless. It's a plot point in the Ron Perlman movies, but it's really not in the comics, so I didn't mention it.
Okay. And it sounds like he is male. Now, do we have any idea about his sexuality or anything like that?
Yeah, so funny story. I knew you were going to ask that, and I was going to say kind of asexual, and then I read the last comic, and it turns out I was wrong. So in the Ron Perlman movies, he has a relationship with Liz Sherman, who is a fire starter. In the comics, she is a very different character and not a romantic interest for Hellboy. it's not until The Storm and the Fury, that he has a romantic interest, and that's Alice Monaghan. Monaghan? I don't remember the name that I said that I put in the slideshow. But it's very brief. It's like they spend a lot of time together while they're going to get the Sword Excalibur and try to stop the end of the world. Yeah. And she kisses him right before he dies, and then he dies. So he kisses a girl once, and he asked her to go back to America with him to rejoin the BPRD and try to help them out because the world started ending and their hands are full. So at the end of the comic book, he was actually planning on joining the BPRD again because they were kind of in dire straits, and then he dies. But in Hellboy in Hell, actually, you meet his wife. At one point, I think there's some throwaway line where he, like, got drunk and accidentally married a vampire. And then, like, wakes up after his wedding night and she tries to kill him. And then they have a fight, and there's, like, a scene of him, like, shooting her while flying out a window saying, "I want a divorce." She tries to kill him in Hell. Because, you know. It was like a note that I made on one of my slides that I didn't say, but throughout a lot of Hellboy in Hell, there's this, like, kind of recurring theme of, like, a cop being in jail, where he runs into a lot of people that he put there. And they're like, "Hey, you're Hellboy, right? You're gonna die, because you killed me." One of those people was his ex-wife. It was a very short marriage.
All right. Yeah, he has a wife. They aren't close. That's all my notes say.
They got divorced via handgun.
Oh, that got dark.
Well, she was a vampire. I mean, you know, I think it's okay.
That's okay. Yeah,
she wasn't like a Twilight vampire that was brooding and like, I don't want to kill people. She was like, I kill lots of people and I'm going to kill you.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like his ideal woman.
No, not so much.
If I was going to guess. Okay, so we're going to assume heterosexual just based on 2 interactions.
Yeah, right.
Okay, and I've got species as a question down here, and it sounds like demon is the closest answer we have?
Half demon, half human. Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, his dad was Satan.
And I apologize. We're getting into a little bit of something I don't totally understand, and I'm sorry, but the universe that he's in, it's not the Marvel universe. It's the Dark Horse universe?
No, he's not really in the dark... Well, okay. Depends on how strict your definition of a universe is. So, Mike Mignola is published by Dark Horse. Dark Horse does not have, like, an extended universe like Marvel does.
Okay.
They're like an indie comic publisher that publishes weird stuff. So I love Dark Horse because they publish weird comics. Technically,
so he's kind of in his own universe. Though.
Yeah. Well, and Mike Mignola has his own his own universe, right? So there are other branching comic books from Hellboy. So there's a run about the BPRD. There's another one called Witchfinder. And then there's another one, I think, about Roger the Homunculus. And then, oh gosh, I'm trying to remember now. There's a few other, I think there's someone named like Edward Gray, who's also, I think he might be the Witch Hunter. Oh, and then Lobster Johnson has a run of comic books.
Okay. Now, does Mike Mignola give this universe a name at all?
Loosely, it's called the Mignolaverse. Not really, no.
Okay. I like the Mignola universe. I think that is incredibly hard to say, therefore fun.
It's never, like, established or fixed. It's just these are characters that pop up in each other's comic books. So, like, Hellboy worked for the BPRD. Lobster Johnson is, like, a fictional character that is real, I guess. Like, Hellboy meets Lobster Johnson as an adult eventually. Who had like a fictional show, and then the Witch Hunter is in Hell at the same time as Hellboy. So, you know.
Okay. Now, you gave me a pretty thorough view of kind of his origin story all the way through kind of his death, it turns out. And so I think I can confirm he is at the end of the comic, he's actually alive.
No, I'd say he's dead. I mean, it's define alive and
weird...
dead.
Yeah.
At the end of what you see in the movie, in terms of the comic books, he is dead and in hell. And then at the end of Hellboy in Hell, I would say that he is passed on to something else. I don't know what that means. The end of the comic book is left vague intentionally, so there's not really like a fixed answer for this. And
that's cool.
So before we recorded, I was going to have you tell me what you thought the story of Hellboy was, and then I forgot to do that, and I'm sorry. It's because I ramble at length forever. But Hellboy to me is one of those stories that does not have a fixed canon, and basically anything you say about him can be true because he is himself folklore or mythology. So that is something that grows and changes organically. So to me, when I saw the end of the comic book, I took it to mean he was no longer in existence even in hell. I don't know what comes after that. Because of that line from The Wizard and the Serpent about, when it was time for the magician to die, he was happy in his passing because he was well loved by the snake. I kind of took that to mean that Hellboy in this moment was happy in his passing because he was well loved by everyone on Earth that he had helped. I did not take it to mean he just like stood alone in this building forever, but it's not. I mean, even the last,
which is what Mike Mignola meant, is he was just going to stand alone in a building,
right? And I mean, Mike Mignola even said he left it written vaguely on purpose, and the last issue of that comic book is told like a folktale. It's told by a demon that's exaggerating what happens at the end of the story. So us, the reader, never actually see an account of what happens at the end of the story. We hear a story about it from another guy who's probably lying in some way. So
that's so interesting.
Really, it's to me, it's entirely up to the reader to determine what happens to Hellboy next. There are no more comic books after this, though. This is the end of the story.
Okay. So, what are kind of his most significant relationships? I have Lobster Johnson down here, and I'm not sure that's actually a fair one.
No,
I also have Alice, but who else would you say is like significant for him?
Trevor Broom would probably be the most significant one, I would say, above those other two. Trevor Broom is the paranormal investigator that adopted him and named him Hellboy, and also kind of the human that raised him to be good, in air quotes. In terms of other relations, Alice Monaghan is an important one. He saved her when she was a child, and then later on she helped him, stop the end of the world, basically. And then in terms of BPRD people, Roger the Homunculus, Abe Sapien, who is like a fish man. You probably saw him in the Hellboy movie you saw. And then Liz Sherman is a fire starter that also is like a team member of Hellboy. And then there's one other team member whose name escapes me. She's like a regular agent who doesn't have any superpowers, but just went on missions with Hellboy. I cannot remember her name for the life of me, though.
Interesting. Okay. And it sounds like his major enemies are, A, whoever's the biggest deal in the mythology that Mike is reading or writing from, and then Nimue at the very end.
And early in the story, Rasputin and Baba Yaga
I have Rasputin down here.
Are consistent protagonists, as well as that pig monster who, his name is not Grom, but that's weird. Like, the pig monster kills a changeling that then possesses the dead body of that pig monster after Hellboy kills it. He's the guy that resurrects Nimue, so he's also kind of a big deal. But I would say, like, your main antagonists are, like, Rasputin, Baba Yaga. One that I didn't mention would be Hecate, who is, like, the queen of vampires. She also tries to corrupt him at one point. And then, Nimue. That'd be it, yeah.
Okay. And it sounds like his kind of squad, so the people that kind of join him would be Roger, Abe Sapien, Liz Sherman, and then that woman with no superpowers.
Yeah, and really just various agents from the BPRD at different times. So they have, like, the BPRD is like a large government organization, so they just have field agent number 3 that gets killed in this issue occasionally. So there are other agents for the BPRD. And then aside from that, he has worked with Lobster Johnson, but that was like a one-time thing. And I'm trying to think if there's anyone else he really ever like leans on as a teammate. I don't really think so.
Now, does he have any major weaknesses?
He's bad at fighting and shooting, and is himself a bullet magnet, which seems like a weird weakness, but it's like, man, does he get stabbed a lot, and he is not a graceful fighter, so he gets hurt constantly. He just gets shot all the time. He is always shot. This is very much noir detective. Like, if you watch a lot of film noir, I love film noir because it's the story about this guy that gets shot in the leg in the first act and then has to limp bleeding through the rest of the story. That's like every Hellboy comic is like, man, does he take a spear to the chest in page 1, and then the rest of the comic book he's bleeding. So, major weakness, he gets stabbed all the time.
Okay.
Technically, later on in the comic book, he's blind in one eye because he gave it to Baba Yaga.
Yeah, I was wondering if, kind of when you described that earlier, if Baba Yaga was both kind of this thing he has to go fight when she's acting up and being feisty and causing problems, and then also kind of this thing that may occasionally accidentally be kind of an ally in certain situations.
So I'm wondering what they're going to do about that in the movie, because Baba Yaga's obviously in it. That's like the chicken-legged house is Baba Yaga's house. And Rasputin is in it as well, briefly, because you see Rasputin summoning him with Nazis at one point in the trailer. But Baba Yaga early in the story is strictly a villain. She is trying to kill Hellboy because Hellboy shot out one of her eyes, hence why she wants his eye at the end.
Seems fair.
Nimue the witch was imprisoned because she started killing all the other witches. So she is an evil enough witch that all the other witches are scared of her. So when Baba Yaga helps Hellboy get to her, I don't really think anyone at that point, no one thinks Hellboy is going to be successful. Nimue is considered to be like way too powerful or whatever. But no one wants Nimue to win. Like, no one wants Nimue to be alive because she's way too dangerous. So villains earlier in the story kind of start helping Hellboy. And even like that changeling that is kind of tortured by his defeat at the hands of Hellboy hates himself for summoning Nimue. Like, he's a kind of a sad character because he just like cries through the background of most of the comics, like hating Hellboy and hating the fact that he's a failure and has nothing to do. So he just kind of in desperation turns to summoning this nightmare creature that kills everything.
That's very short-sighted, but okay.
Well, and it's an interesting way of telling folklore, and this I think again is like the stories that Mike Mignola wants to tell, is like there are evil creatures that Hellboy is fighting, but ultimately like the Fae are no longer in power, and Hellboy is an antagonist for them. Like, they want to be hunting humans and can't be. So it's kind of in desperation that it's kind of because of Hellboy in some way that they turn to this like end of the world option, because their world's ending either way.
Okay. That's interesting. Now, does he have... Certain characters kind of have a special thing, like a familiar or a special attack or a special weapon or a special piece, like part of transportation. Does he have any of those things?
He has his red hand that is good at punching things.
Red punching hand.
Yeah, and then this is like a little nod that I like in the comic. So he has a revolver that he carries through most of the comic, and he uses a lot of different guns, and I think it's just whatever gun Mike Mignola wants to carry or wants him to be carrying. But through a lot of it, he carries this big revolver that was given to him by the Liberty Torch, that is technically not Captain America, but I mean he was a super American that fought in World War II, so it's Captain America, you know.
Yeah.
But the Liberty Torch was there when Hellboy was found, and he's the one that taught Hellboy how to shoot and eventually gave him this revolver. Hellboy loses it all the time. By the end of the comic, he doesn't have it. He's carrying a World War II era semi-automatic pistol. But through part of it, he has a revolver called the Samaritan. It's in the movies. Like, you see it in the trailer for the movie when he's like, some dads give their kid Legos. It's like, well, your dad didn't give you that gun. Whatever. I can get all persnickety about this, but your dad gave you books. Whatever. They always make Hellboy dumb. He's not, like... In one of Hellboy's investigations, the person he's helping calls him Dr. Boy because he seems that scholarly. He's supposed to be, like, a well-read, intelligent person, but whatever.
So it sounds like they took the more of the iconic character of our kind of like Milo is the best thing I can think of. Like our scrawny, nerdy intellectual that we see in so many of these things where, you know, they're not people that you would ever put out on a battlefield because they're too intellectual and they have no idea what they're doing. And they crammed that mentality and that kind of stereotype into the body of what should be taking over hell. And there's kind of this constant tension of like, everybody wants to fight me because I'm big and scary, but I'm actually really shit at fighting.
Well, I say he's bad at fighting. He like is strong. He's just not graceful. So it's like, I think he kind of leans on being somewhat indestructible and stronger than most things, but he just gets hurt a lot. Like in the first fight in the comic book, he like almost dies. He's just like, a frog monster sucks the life out of him, and he's like half dying as he throws it out a window, and he's like, "Ah, crap, I'm dead. My arms don't work anymore." You know. One person described him as a very blue collar monster hunter. He's very experienced, so he's just kind of like curmudgeonly about it at some point. As he's like, this giant monster comes up, and he's like, "Oh shoot, that thing's gonna punch me," and then it punches him in the head, and he's like, "Ow, my brain."
Well, he sounds like a really interesting character.
He is my favorite.
So,
this is the best comic ever.
Oh my gosh, he's really cool. This is none of what I was expecting to walk into.
I know!
I like this so much better than what I thought I was going to get.
Kelsey,
this is amazing.
You should read Hellboy. There's only a lot of it, but it's
like,
very
I
good.
Want to.
It's very. If you're like a fan of mythology, it's just a treat because it reads so much like mythology, and the art is so beautiful. But anyway, sorry. Do you have any other questions? I will talk forever about
most
this.
Of it. Let's get this last quiz going.
Okay, last quiz. Who was the creator of Hellboy?
Mike Mignola.
Pretty good on the name pronunciation. Give me an example of some of Hellboy's roommates.
The two old Italian ghost women.
Yes. He actually does that multiple times. At one point, he's living with the ghost of one of Trevor Broom's friends. Like someone finds out where he is, and they're like, "Isn't that the house of that dead guy?" And Hellboy's just been like talking to this guy because he can just see ghosts sometimes. Who are Hellboy's mother and father?
That would be a dead witch and the devil.
Yep. What team is Hellboy affiliated with sometimes? I read the questions out of order. I'm sorry.
That's okay. The BPRD, the Bureau for Paranormal Research and Defense.
Correct. What was the first comic book Hellboy appeared in?
Oh, hey, this is way down here. I've got it on here because Chris always asks. So at this point, so the first one is the Next Men issue 21, which was published by Dark Horse.
That's the one I got very wrong. I thought it was the Seeds of Destruction issue 1. Nope. Not even the first Hellboy comic. Okay, name one example of an enemy Hellboy has fought.
Baba Yaga.
It's a great one. Fights her all the time. Aside from Satan, what character from mythology is Hellboy related to?
Ooh, King Arthur.
Correct. Who wrote The Magician and the Snake?
That would be Mike's daughter, Katie.
Yes. Who summons Hellboy?
Rasputin.
Which two comic books does it appear the new movie is based off of?
That would be those very last ones, those names I did not write down at all. Oh gosh, I can't even remember what they were all called. Nope.
Well, one of them...
Wait, no, the Wild Hunt was one of them.
Uh-huh.
And I have no idea what the other one was.
So, Kelsey, I was like really banking on you knowing that answer. It was the Storm and the Fury.
And the Fury.
Obviously. take better notes than I take, Kelsey. Gosh.
Hey, I've got like 4 pages of notes on my end. Like,
All right. And that's all I got for you, Kelsey. That's Hellboy in way too long of, I'm sure, an episode, but I
wow.
have
Well,
trouble.
everybody, yeah, that will do it for our class on Hellboy. Next week, we will be jumping back into our very last Marvel Marathon deep dive into one of the Marvel characters that's a little bit less developed on screen. And so if you would like this, if you actually enjoyed this content, hey, this was a brand new presenter, a brand new professor for this particular Dead Funny. So Cody, thank you so much for joining me and teaching me and us so much about Hellboy. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe. Turn on the notifications so you know when to come to class. And as always, please feel free to come and interact with us in the comments. If there's anything Cody screwed up, let him know. If there's anything he spelled wrong in the PowerPoint, I saw it, I know you did, feel free to let him know in the comments. We'll just ream him a new one and make fun of him mercilessly because we can. Otherwise, you're welcome to find us on our Twitch links or follow us on Twitter. Thank you guys so much for coming to class, and we'll see you later. Bye, friends.
Bye.